My name is Matthew Bishop and I'm Senior Lecturer in International Politics here at the University of Sheffield. I work on Caribbean development, broadly conceived, and spent the early part of my career working at the University of the West Indies. Why does the 75th anniversary of the Empire Windrush matter? Well, the boat docked at Tilbury on the 21st of June 1948. This is often viewed as the start of a process in which migration from what were then the colonies into Britain began to gather pace. But I would suggest actually it was simply one step in a much longer history, a 500-year history, in which Britain and other colonial powers effectively created the modern Caribbean, placing it at the time brutally at the centre of the global economy, with plantation slavery and sugar production producing untold riches for plantocrats who were the masters of the universe of that very peculiar order, holding seats in Westminster while owning estates throughout the West Indies. Windrush is not really the beginning, it's an intermediate process in a much wider and longer historical story. So as I note in my own book, The Political Economy of Caribbean Development, at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, France at the time was prepared to cede the whole of Canada and America west of the Mississippi River for simply Guadeloupe. And Guadeloupe was far from being the most productive sugar island. Haiti owned that dubious accolade, and it was followed by Jamaica. The scale of wealth that was generated in the few hundred years before the Windrush docked at Tilbury was astonishing, and it powered the development of many European countries. Yet just 50 years after the end of the 7 Years' War, this entire order had decisively unravelled, but its legacies will arguably last forever. To compare it to today, you need to imagine all of the most powerful bankers in the world also owning all of the oil companies, while also sitting directly in the Westminster Parliament making laws to sustain their interests. And then when it collapses, they are compensated to the tune of 40% of the Treasury budget, which in today's money is over 400 billion, enough to buy 100 Manchester Uniteds or fund 4 NHSs. I want to make 5 broad points about why Windrush matters. It shows how British and Caribbean history are inextricably linked with each other, and indeed always have been over the last half a millennium. Not so long ago, David Lammy, who could potentially be the next Foreign Secretary in Britain, famously said in Parliament in a debate about migration, "I am here because you were there." And what he meant essentially is that the Caribbean in its contemporary form would not exist were it not for British colonialism. And the people who stepped off the Empire Windrush in 1948, it's crucial to remember, were at the time British citizens, and the places they came from were all British colonies. If we think back to this long 500-year history, is that from 1492 onwards, when the colonial powers gradually came to exterminate all of pre-existing society in the region, they created what Gordon Lewis famously called, in a book called The Growth of the Modern West Indies, a tabula rasa. That is to say, they wiped out the pre-existing society and created a new one, a distinctively Creole one. So it's impossible to understand the development of the modern Caribbean without understanding British and French and all of the other colonial powers' action in creating it. This is a new society. It isn't a society that existed previously. And it's important to note that there have been massive contributions of West Indians globally. So we think, obviously, of kind of the Jamaican sprinters like Usain Bolt, who have had such success in sport. St. Lucia, small island in the Eastern Caribbean, has produced 2 Nobel Prize winners, Sir Arthur Lewis, the economist, and the novelist Derek Walcott. The Caribbean has produced 2 Commonwealth Secretaries General, endless winners of literary prizes, and this is a reflection of that distinctive Creole culture. Reggae music is obviously globally famous, but I would say that Trinidad and Tobago has probably had even more success in terms of developing 5 or 6 distinct genres of music, and soca in particular indirectly dominates all pop music production today. And there have been huge contributions in Britain from people of Caribbean descent. So take Marcus Rashford and all the wonderful work that he's done over the last few years as one amongst many examples. Marcus Rashford's parents are of Jamaican and Castilian descent. The second point, I think, is worth making about why Windrush still matters is that Slavery and the plantation still shape Caribbean societies, and I would suggest they still shape ours. In the region, in the Caribbean, in many societies, the social structures and the hierarchies that exist are a reflection of that earlier history and have led, in some cases, to relatively maldistributed wealth and opportunity. So there are stark patterns of marginalisation and inequality that exist in many Caribbean societies. Now, this is not something you would realise, perhaps, if you spend all of your time thinking of the Caribbean as this kind of paradise tourist destination. So one of the real problems is that the exoticisation of tourist destinations obscures the reality of life for everyday people who are still grappling in many cases with the legacies of hundreds of years of colonialism. If you're interested in this, two great books you might look at are Polly Petullo's Last Resorts or Angelique Nixon's Resisting Paradise, which examine the problems of Caribbean tourism and its links to those earlier kind of colonial legacies. If we think about the Windrush as one episode in a much longer history that spans many hundred years, the fact is that the Caribbean was constructed as a space by the colonial powers where people moved and circulated constantly. So migration is a fact of Caribbean life. People have always moved between the region and outside, coming back and then leaving again, and they likely always will. The people who stepped off the Windrush and their descendants live in a space that is geographically rooted in Britain in many cases, but it is culturally a space that is transnational in scope. And as I said earlier, that is a consequence of the particular methodologies that the colonial powers brought to bear on establishing and integrating the Caribbean into the wider global economy over many hundred years. The third point to note is that the Windrush scandal has not gone away. So when we use the word Windrush in Britain today, in general, we think about the scandal that kind of exploded in around about 2017, when it became clear that many members of the Windrush generation, i.e. the people who arrived in the 1940s, and their children, essentially were stripped of their citizenship. So as I said earlier, these people arrived as British citizens. Quite often their papers were minimal. Over many years, they may have stayed in Britain and never got a passport. And then when the Home Office destroyed a whole series of records after the coalition government came to power in 2010, essentially what happened is these people's citizenship was lost. And this coincided with the nastiness of Theresa May's hostile environment policy, which essentially conflated these people who by rights were British citizens with kind of the migrant communities that came under threat from that policy. And this is still something that, to the shame of the British state, has not ever really been decisively resolved. Many victims of this scandal were deported back to Caribbean countries, places where they hadn't stepped foot for many decades. A number of the families still haven't received compensation from the schemes that have been set up, and quite a number of them have been left to die abroad. In some cases, they were denied the treatment that they were supposed to have for different illnesses that they were suffering. And I think this suggests, and the importance of it, the wider analytical point here, is that it suggests that really nobody's citizenship is safe, no matter how much we think it might be. And that this episode raises fairly serious questions about the UK's commitment to international norms. So there's a broader set of debates ongoing at the moment about the way in which the government is attempting to rebadge perfectly legitimate asylum seekers and refugees as illegal immigrants. There's also a whole set of debates occurring around the Rwanda deportation plan, and some radical voices on the right of British politics are even talking about leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. The Windrush scandal is the thin end of a very, very problematic wedge. The fourth point I'd like to make about why Windrush still matters relates to the case for reparatory justice. For a long time, campaigners from the Caribbean have demanded reparations for the longer-term developmental losses that have been caused by the extraction of wealth from their societies over many hundreds of years. Rich countries are evidently responsible for establishing the global colonial economy a system and structure that extracted wealth over many hundreds of years, as I've already said. So there's evidently opposition from a number of places to the reparations agenda. But it's also the case that a number of organisations, from some British universities, for example, to more recently, the Guardian newspaper, if not yet the British state or many of its elites, are investigating their links to slavery. There are many forms that reparations can take. They don't just have to involve monetary compensation. And it seems to me that the fact that we're having those conversations, particularly those that coalesced more widely around the Black Lives Matter movement, is really interesting and important in terms of a historical reckoning. And the key point here worth reiterating is that it's important to note that slavery wasn't an event. It wasn't just an isolated process that was ended once it was formally abolished. Of course, modern slavery affects many millions of people the world over, even today. But the point is that it was an ongoing process in the Caribbean that unleashed a whole range of other processes, even when abolition occurred, that continue to echo across generations, including our own. And the final point to note about why Windrush still matters is it forces us to think about the position of the Caribbean in general in the world today. And the Caribbean is on the front line of climate change. Small island developing states, or SIDS, as they're sometimes called in the literature, are deeply vulnerable to the effects of climate change. They have a heightened exposure to exogenous shocks, and they're affected by disasters in ways that larger countries simply are not. So take the example of Hurricane Ivan, which hit the island of Grenada in the early 2000s. It did damage amounting to around about 200% of GDP. Hurricane Irma, similarly in 2017, hit the country of Antigua-Barbuda and completely flattened the island of Barbuda to the extent that every single person on the island had to leave. In the British example, it is inconceivable that we could think of a disaster that could force 70 million people all to have to vacate the territory, essentially overnight. The way in which these shocks hit small islands cause disproportionate damage. And the worst thing about this is that climate change is accelerating. So some SIDS are experiencing a whole range of risks beyond simply the immediate shocks. So saltwater intrusion, changes to biodiversity, invasive species, worse droughts, floods, so on and so forth. And they're often termed to be the canaries in the coal mine of climate change. So what happens in small islands is a harbinger, really, for the things that are going to hit many other countries as time goes on. Some small islands are even at risk of disappearing. What happens to their populations and their sovereignty when this occurs? So as this intensifies, the world is going to have to find ways to relieve debt, improve access to aid and concessional finance, mitigate climate change, provide migratory opportunities. So instead of closing off migration routes, increasingly we're going to have to open them up for climate refugees. But much of our political debate, unfortunately, is moving in the direct opposite direction. So why does it matter that the Caribbean is on the front line of climate change in terms of Windrush? Well, the reason that climate change is intensifying is because of industrial development in the richer countries. So hundreds of years of accumulated emissions. Those emissions and the development that underpinned them was driven to a substantial degree by the labour of enslaved people in the Caribbean, generating huge wealth from sugar for a couple of hundred years that preceded the end of slavery. And as a consequence, the Caribbean is the main victim, really, of climate change. So the international community has a duty to help to resolve those challenges. So let me finish by plugging a think tank that I set up recently with some colleagues called the Resilient and Sustainable Islands Initiative, which is based at the Overseas Development Institute, or ODI, in London. And our task is to actually find solutions to these questions. Those are the reasons why I think Windrush really matters. It forces us to think about a much wider and bigger story about Britain's relationship with the Caribbean over a very, very long time frame.